unfortunately, again, as you alluded to at the beginning of the program, challenge us in anything we say, but this is true. Privacy is dead in this country. It's over, okay? There is absolutely nothing you can do to get it back. There are certain incremental improvements, as it might be. If you listen carefully and you become a student of this, you might be able to help your children. But there's almost no one in this studio who can recover their privacy now because you've been lulled into a false sense of complacency, and you don't begin to understand, I use the word forces, completely wrong word, but as it is the assets that have been applied to you, whether it's been a government intelligence asset or whether it just has to do with a business trying to data mine, as it might be. There is no such thing as privacy.
Go deeper into that. What does that mean? Like for instance, I go to doctors. I don't want them to put me into their computers. If you don't keep your records on paper, I don't go see you.
We'll get through this on the next board. We can go through all the categories, but it's telecommunications, it's your financial records, it's your schooling, it is every purchase you make, it's the things that you eat. A perfect example, we've all heard about pre-existing conditions from an insurance standpoint. That's been a battle for the last few years. I mean, that is just the tip of a very large iceberg, which is they're trying to determine, well, you had a pre-existing condition, we're not going to insure you. Well, the entire insurance industry is broken, but that is a microcosm when you can't get insurance because the world, a database as it might be, and we'll come back to what that means, a database recorded that particular health issue. It never goes away. One of the mantras that we're going to teach you today, there are really two things that if you walk away from this program, it's the lens you need to look at through the world. In fact, before we get to that, let's talk about this. As this program, the idea behind this program developed, we tried to ground it. Initially, it was going to be about surveillance, and then we were going to do another program about preparation, and Glenn had the good idea of trying to put these things together because ultimately it impinges on liberty. Now, we've done a half circle here representing there are umpteen different categories that fall into liberty. It could be having capitalism, it could be free speech, it could be freedom of movement, it could be a variety of different things. And we could talk about that at some point, but for the purposes of today, the nexus of government surveillance and corporate data collection, as it might be, which is privacy is dead. And on the other hand, preparation, which is we're all incredibly dependent on a supply chain. What can we do today to try to mitigate that risk? So to go back to that lens that we want to talk to, there are two things that I think about constantly every day. One is, don't forget the term, databases never forget. Once the data is in a database, it's all over. It'll never get there. And if you can figure out a way to keep it out of the database, and there are a variety of ways to do that, sometimes you're going to help.
Wait. What should we try to keep out? I mean, at this point, what would you say, like, you know what, don't put that in the database. Don't ever put that in a database.
I'll give you a perfect example. Recently, I was in on the behalf of a client, and we were changing some car titles on them. They wanted to know my driver's license number because we were doing the work associated with that client, and I wasn't going to give them my driver's license number. They insisted upon it, and they got a driver's license number that perhaps didn't match.
Right.
So there are ways, and we didn't break any laws or no issues.
But your driver's license number is already in the system.
Yeah, but I didn't have any nexus to that client and those vehicles that they own.
Okay.
It could be the doctor's office that wants to have your Social Security number. In your monologue, you talked about national ID and the fact we might all have a unifying password. Well, how's that Social Security number worked out for everyone? Okay, you know, that is an unmitigated disaster in this country, and that is our de facto ID number. I mean, it is, look at whether we talk about border security and false documents, whether we talk about all the nonsense associated with the government mandating these certain regulatory issues, and we'll come back and talk about that. So in any event, if we talk about databases never forget, and the other favorite of mine is 2 is 1 and 1 is none. What that really does is talks about redundancy. It's really if, from a military perspective, if you were to be perhaps working in a very austere, difficult environment, you had to bring in everything you needed to do, and you had a piece of equipment that was contingent upon completing that mission, you darn better well have 2 of those, because if the one fails, you're there and you have no purpose. So when you're talking about your life, and I'm talking about your life in certain circumstances, okay, you better have 2 of these things, and that's a good way to think about it. So in any event, as we begin to look at these 2 worlds, I think we can begin to look at each one of these segments, and perhaps at a commercial we'll look at the next board and we can dive into some of those things.
Okay, so this makes my head hurt. Give me an example of something that you should have 2 of.
Well, 10% of the population is in what we call a medically dependent stage, where if we remove their access to timely medicines, they literally will perish. So a perfect.
How many? What's the percentage?
About 10% of the population.
Okay.
I mean, we know the underlying data, which is if there was ever an EMP in the country, and we can talk about that in a moment, 10% of the population would be dead inside of 2 weeks because they wouldn't have their medicine. There's just nothing we could do.
So Barrett Moore is here, a life continuity expert, and he is telling us about this wheel and now the specific things that we have to do. What is under surveillance and how do you prepare? What is databases never forget, and 2 is 1 and 1 is none?
Well, I think we could give you some anecdotal evidence as it is as to what is happening in each one of these segments. Now, before people barrage you on emails, we don't have enough blackboard space to begin going through all the categories. For example, in the surveillance world, there are about 18 areas that we spend a lot of time worrying about. There'd be sectors of our lives where information is being collected. So we have 7 here. And in a preparation space, there are about 30 categories you need to be worried about, and we're going to cover 7.
We are working on a project together with Mercury to bring this information, to bring it out to the general public, to be the authoritative source for life continuity.
Because this is the #1 question of how do we prepare, and you guys are the best at it. All right.
Well, there's a mind-boggling array of information out there, and a lot of it's awful good. So let's talk a little bit about the surveillance area where we have some vulnerability. So we'll kind of talk about the bad, and then we're going to talk about the good being how you can, as it is, live on the edge of the herd. That's another one of my mantras, which is have the courage within your community, your family, your friends, your corporations to live on the edge of the herd. What's that mean? You don't have to be like everyone else. Just because no one else is prepared doesn't mean that you don't have to be unprepared. The single greatest mistake I see with clients is they believe in checkbook capitalism, which is, I've got a checkbook, I've got some financial resources, what else do I need to do? It couldn't be further from the truth. Okay? That checkbook, in the time of need, in the time of things that could go bad, and they come in a variety of flavors, that checkbook arguably isn't going to do anything for you. So listen carefully. So let's just talk about the financial world, which is, in fact, let's skip to communications because it's easier, which is if I have your phone records, I have your home phone record, I have your business phone records, and I have your cell phone records. I own you, okay? I know everyone you know, okay? I know everyone you communicate with. I can look at the patterns. I can determine where you live. I can find your family. And that is information that's readily available. Again, it's supposed to be private, but it is readily available, and that's just due to technology as it might be. Interesting enough, the NSA, the National Security Agency, is, of course, the biggest transgressor. There has been, you may have followed this over the last 4 or 5 years, the NSA has basically been spying on Americans, even though it's against the law, and they've been doing that for well over a decade. And
Bill Clinton announced this. What was the name of that server, or that computer farm? What is it? Echelon.
Well, it's gone well beyond Echelon.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
Echelon was a system that, in essence, took signals out of the air and examined them. What's happened is they have a separate program, and it goes by a variety of names. But what it's done is they've actually gone in on the internet backbones, and they developed a technology. It's called a digital splitter. And what it ensured is that every communication that came across that trunk line, as it was duplicated. One went off to their server farm, and the other one went off and was delivered to its intended recipient. They literally are choking on data. Now, interesting enough, at Camp Williams in Utah, the NSA is in the late stages of completing a brand new 1 million square foot data center because they, of course, ran out of room at Fort Meade. Well, Fort Meade really ran out of room because the government, great guys, look, they're on our side by and large, okay? Don't ever misconstrue that I'm against the government, I'm against our intelligence services. But sometimes they get a little rambunctious and they forget that we have civil liberties. But the reality of that is the impediment at Fort Meade in expanding it was they were sucking too much electricity out of the grid, and they couldn't pull any more out of it without building a whole series of new nuclear power plants, which, of course, get the environmentalists involved.
And if I can jump in here a second, Glenn, something that's fascinating is there was a paper done at the Brookings Institute about how it is getting less and less expensive to store more and more data. And we have this interesting paradigm that's happening now where it is actually nudging dictators further into being dictators, and relatively free governments are now saying, well, wait a second, I can store one of the interesting pieces of intel or information I came up with, that if you wanted to store all the telephone conversations in the United States now, it basically cost you 17 cents a year per person. By 2015, that'll be 2 cents a year per person. And there was a great formula done.
Good thing we're going to be broke.
Well, but we're going to be broke, but
We
what's
are
interesting, we are broke. What's interesting, though, is that if the government wants to do this stuff, what people see coming is a public safety tax, so that citizens will actually have to pay for being observed and being under surveillance all the time. So it's an interesting thing to see as the technology improves, it actually encourages governments.
I had a guy call me. He was, you know, a decent figure in Google, and he told me we're digging trenches around our server farms. He said we have pretty good trenches. He said, but we're digging these things. I think he said 10 feet deep. And I said, oh, okay. And he said, you might want to look into the relationship between Google and the government. We seem to be in business with the government. I don't know what they're doing, but it's pretty darn interesting that the government is looking even for more space for servers. They're building it also, a huge one in Virginia.
And they can dig ditches outside Google, but they can't do it at the border.
Yeah.
That's another.
Yeah.
Well, Glenn, actually, that you're touching arguably on the social media space. And notwithstanding there have been some phenomenal developments there, whether we're talking about Twitter, Facebook, MySpace, whatever it might be. If you dig deep enough, you can actually find some of the organizations that funded those entities.
Oh, no, come on. Don't, come on.
Hanging it out there.
Well, the Central Intelligence Agency has a venture capital firm. They've had it for 15 years. They've had it about 10 years. And they fund nascent early technologies, and if it happens to have a nexus that complements their mission, so be it. So the social media space has been the absolute greatest boon to the people that want to monitor us.
This is why the Library of Congress is now saving every tweet, every Facebook, everything.
And what is today? Today's the one-year anniversary of the uprising in Egypt, which was largely credited to Twitter and YouTube. So it's interesting that we should be here tonight.
Okay.
We could do a whole program on the social media and
we
the
will.
negative ramifications of it. It's particularly scary.
All right, so let's go to a little bit of preparation here. Or does anybody have any questions on anything yet? You guys are just like... None, okay. All right, here we go.
Preparation. There are about 30 categories where we need to be prepared, and they run the gamut. Preparation really falls into two worlds. One for immediate need. You've got now a nice, wonderful 72-hour pack. Are you going to protect a defined group of people for a defined period of time? Or are we worried about, as it might be, the collapse of society, and we're worried about what we call sustainability? Those are really kind of two different worlds. Today we're talking about preparation. We're talking about your interruption of the supply chain due to a natural disaster, or it could be a financial disaster, as it might be. One only really has to look at any individual, whether it's the tuna fish we eat, or whether it's the peanut butter that goes on our sandwiches, or it's the aspirin that's on the store shelves. The United States has been the leader in the technology that underpins an incredibly efficient supply chain. It is lowered our cost. It's absolutely brilliant. But unfortunately, there's good with bad. Inadvertently, as corporations have become more and more efficient in terms of delivering goods, and we've come to suffer from what I call the 7-Eleven effect. And what the 7-Eleven effect is, we are 2 generations deep of people in this nation who have only ever known 7-Eleven to be open 24 hours a day and the store shelves be full. So why in the world would I have to have a pantry? I can go down to 7-Eleven. I can, the stores are always open. Well, if you understood how often they got resupplied, all one has to do is look at the videos that take place post a hurricane, or pre-hurricane and post a hurricane, and you see those big empty shelves.
Anybody tell me how many times are the grocery stores resupplied? Weekly? Every night?
It depends on where the grocery store, whether it's suburban or it's rural, but the average grocery store gets 14 deliveries a day. Under normal uses, the store shelves are empty within 3 days. If there's a run on something, it's hours. But that's on average. Now, the chain stores are slightly different, but the stuff you care about, it's hard to come by. Now, this is expensive stuff. I mean, the reality about preparation, and we all have to live under budgets, is you're asking yourself to advance expenses theoretically into the future. So what that means is if you wanted to protect yourself and have the necessities on hand to protect your family, as it might be, for 1 month, then you have to look at what it costs to operate your family for a period of 1 month and anticipate all those needs in a variety of categories. So if we look at life's necessities, they actually start with air. It's a little more complicated subject than we want to go in today. But we've got, obviously, water. You can't go much more than about 3 days without water. Food, shelter, there's clothing in there. A plan is important. Fuel and power important. Medical is important. Mindset is important. But the list goes on. There's a myriad of things. Transportation, communication, spare parts. It goes on and on and on.